Hello and welcome back to Pictorial on Relay FM. I'm Quinn Rose. I am someone who did not go to art school, but I love learning about art history and new artists.
Hi, I'm Betty. I'm also someone who did not go to art school, but I also really love learning about art history, new artists that I've known for a long time that I'm still learning new things about. And that's kind of the case with the artist we're going to talk about today, which is someone whose works I see on a weekly basis, where I work as a gallery guide here in Toronto. So I will tell you about all my discoveries over the years.
Yeah, this is an episode topic that was driven by Betty's desire to talk about a Canadian for once.
Yeah, I've noticed that I don't think we've even gone to cover like international artists and Chinese artists, and I'm like, I don't think we've actually talked about a Canadian artist, and we should.
So of course we had to represent for Betty. So today we are talking about your selection, which is William Kurelek. I did not know this artist beforehand. I actually had literally never heard of him, and so I was like, "Sounds good." When you suggested this, can't wait to find out more. But I would love if you could kind of take it away and explain who this person is and why you want to talk about him.
When I started to think about who we would talk about as our first Canadian artist, he kind of came to mind pretty quickly. Like, obviously, he doesn't represent all Canadians, and there's so many different kinds of, Canadians of all shapes and sizes and forms that, we could have an entire show just dedicated to Canadian artists. But this is someone that I think kind of represents being Canadian pretty well, at least in his time. So he is somebody who was born in Canada, but he came from immigrant parents. He's Ukrainian Canadian. He kind of lived all over Canada, mostly in the prairies as well as Toronto. And he did travel to other parts of Canada as well as all over the world eventually. And he studied in Canada, and most particularly because a lot of his subject matter in his paintings are Canadian, whether it's landscapes or people or portraits or the scenes that he paints. They're very distinctively Canadian, and he is somebody who painted his life around him. Although when he got older, things got a bit weird, which we can talk about. And his influences are ranges from European artists to Canadian and American artists to even Mexican artists. So there's a pretty big range of where he comes from. I think when most people think of Canada, actually, I don't know if most people even think about Canada, or if most people who do think about Canada can even come up with a Canadian artist. But I just know that historically, Canada has promoted Impressionist artists like the Group of Seven and Tom Thomson officially quite a bit, and they're everywhere in our galleries. Our art galleries, half of it is Group of Seven. They're very widely collected and very well known, and they're definitely very great artists. But I just think I'm so sick of them that I want to talk about other people. And also, I don't necessarily really think that they represent Canada all that well. Although, having said that, no single person or single artist, even group of artists, would represent all of us. But yeah, so that's kind of a gist of why I chose Kurelek as someone to talk about as our first introduction to Canada.
That's great. And I will say that when I started reading about him, I was very intrigued by how much his art very clearly represented his life and the world around him. And obviously all artists are always pulling from their personal experiences and everything, but there was different keystones of his life that played out in his art over and over again thematically, and the way that his childhood and his early adult experiences just really shaped the way that he looked at the world, and that he wasn't afraid to be very overt with the stuff that he was representing in his art, to the point where he got in trouble sometimes because he was too aggressive with the messaging in his paintings. I thought was very interesting.
Yeah, I guess my initial like what I've been wondering is, and yeah, since you didn't know the artist before, and to be honest, I had no idea who he was either before I started working at the gallery and saw his work. So I was also kind of, just introduced to him by this huge collection of his work, like in my face. So I guess maybe just the question of like, do you like his artwork? Do you like his style? Would you have it in your house, etc.?
What would you do if I was like, I hate him?
I would not be your friend forever. No, I'm just kidding. I would respect that opinion, but I would actually be very intrigued in why.
No, I don't hate him at all. When I was looking at his art, I actually found that I could kind of divide them into two basic spheres, because later in his life, he became a very successful children's book illustrator.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so obviously like the work that he was doing for children's book is kind of like its own thing. But even beyond that, there are other like lots of work that he did that was kind of depicting landscape and everyday life in Canada, and these other images that are like, we're representing like happy little snippets of life in the world around us, which they're very well done, but they're not something that like particularly speak to me emotionally. And then there are lots of other work that he did that was super weird and interesting, where he was depicting things like, this is what the inside of my brain looks like when I'm in a mental institution, and this is like my interpretation of my Catholic religion and the way that it exists in the world right now, through these very distinctive styles of artwork where I'm like painting in a realistic style, but painting fantastical things and fantastical expressions of my own brain and the way that I'm seeing the world, so that you can, through my paintings, see a little bit of how I'm seeing the world. And I really liked those kinds of things that he did, where it wasn't just like, here's what I'm literally seeing, but like, here's what I'm figuratively seeing as well.
Yeah, for sure. I think he's definitely someone who has had a very distinctive style, and I would call some of his work definitely surreal. And I think in that way is kind of why some people compare his work to like Norman Rockwell, or even I sometimes think of like Edward Hopper, like those surreal scenes of like streets and like, cafes and stuff. Not necessarily in the same way, but he has that bit of that style to it where like it's realistic, but it's also not, and you're kind of creeped out by it.
Depends on the piece. Yeah.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, his parents and some of his grandparents originally came from villages in Bukovina, which today are a part of Ukraine, modern day Ukraine. And his father immigrated with his grandparents to East Central Alberta. And then his mother's family had immigrated also to Alberta previously, and then his mother was born in Alberta. And so in 1923, his father also immigrated to Alberta and then married his mother in Russian Orthodox Church in 1925. And he was born in 1927, and he was born and baptized in Russian Orthodox Church. And so his family lived they lived on a dairy farm in Stonewall, Manitoba throughout most of his childhood. He was actually raised only speaking Ukrainian. He began attending an English-only public school when when it became time for him to go to public school. But obviously, he didn't speak any English, and I read in certain biographies that he was made fun of for, even though he was born in Canada, he was essentially an immigrant because he didn't speak English, and he was treated probably not so well. And so but obviously he eventually finishes high school, and then he goes to the University of Manitoba for university. But then I think in the summers, and then he worked at these lumber camps in Northern Ontario, and he actually He met a fine arts student when he was studying in the University of Manitoba, and he actually became quite interested in the fine arts, even though he majored in like a Bachelor of General Arts degree in and the majoring in Latin, English, and history. But then his parents and his siblings actually moved to a farm in Ontario after he graduates from university. So then he actually moved to Ontario with them, and then he started studying art at the Ontario College of Art, which at the time was called OCA. And then later on, it was renamed OCAD for Ontario College of Art and Design. And then later on, it was renamed OCAD-U for Ontario College of Art and Design University. It's our university with like endless letters tacking onto the end of their name. I actually have a few friends who went there. It's right next to the AGO, the OCAD-U, and it is quite a well-known university. Most people who study fine arts or design kind of go to OCAD-U, and so he did that as well.
It's also worth noting that at this time that he was starting to formally study art, his parents explicitly were not a fan of this, and his father especially really did not approve of him pursuing his artistic talents, and it was difficult for him to convince his father to even let him go study art, something that would continue to be a theme throughout the rest of his life.
Yeah, for sure. And I think in addition to him kind of not having a great time at school during his childhood, he also, obviously had a tough time with his family and with his parents disapproving of his art. One of Kurelek's childhood influences was Diego Rivera, the Mexican muralist that we spoke about on a previous podcast. And he apparently his father, one time when he was a kid, found him in his room like drawing all over the walls, and then was like furious and was like, "Oh my God, like, what are you doing?" And I mean, I guess if any parent found their kid drawing all over the walls, they might not be so pleased about it. Not just because they want to pursue like an art degree, but also because they're drawing all over the walls. And then there's actually a painting that I was going to get into a bit later. It's a painting called Watering Cows in Winter. And so that's a painting that he did like later on, but it's alluding to his childhood where, so it was on the farm and he was supposed to be like, feeding the cows or water. But it's a picture of him using an axe to try to thaw the ice of the bucket of water that had frozen over, and apparently it was his fault that the water was left out and froze overnight. And like his father then was like, "Oh my God, like, why can't you be more like your brother who can actually do things properly and not screw up like you?" And then in the picture, in the painting, I believe behind him is like some cows, and then his brother herding the cows, and his brother's like with a whip or something. And so he's kind of and he's there going like, "Oh my God, I have to thaw all this ice." And so it's a depiction of how, you know, he felt like such a loser while his brother's like always better than him. And of course his parents made it very clear that's how they felt. So yeah, like you mentioned, he didn't have a great relationship with his parents, and kind of always felt like he was in the shadow of his brother. So yeah, having said that, despite the fact that he really loved art, wanted to pursue it, he really hated it at OCA. Like, he didn't like the formal, traditional way art was being taught. And I think that actually is the case of a lot of art students. I actually have a couple friends who went to the same school, who actually dropped out within the first or second year because they felt similarly. They were like, I just don't feel like this traditional way of teaching art is, you know, it is really something that does it for me. So he actually he left school, and then he then moved to Edmonton, and then he started just painting on his own. And I think he did his first self-portrait in 1950. And then sort of throughout this time, he like hitchhikes all over Canada and the United States. He even eventually goes down to Mexico because he was interested in studying Mexican art. Like I mentioned, he was really inspired by Diego. And so, but like by 1951, he was like, I want to go to Europe. Like, I want to go explore.
And him going like country by country and just one by one being disillusioned by the art education there is just like so relatable that this young person was just really trying to learn art. And then there's two options, like either was experiencing like poor teaching and like non-inspiring work, or was like kind of too pretentious to deal with it. I can't get a good enough sense of him to guess which one it is. I think it's the first, because like he seemed like he had a lot of genuine interest in these art forms before he would get to each location. But just reading it, the word like disillusioned came up so many times that I was like, boy, you're having a rough time of this, huh?
For sure. I actually think it might be a third reason, or maybe a combination of all of the above. I think it's probably him dealing with debilitating depression that was basically like something he had to deal with his whole life. Like I think it's like he gets inspired. It's like, I'll move to this other place and I'll find something I love, and then he goes there and it's like, yeah, I'm so depressed.
Yeah, the classic thinking that changing your location will change your mental illness.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, so he eventually takes a cargo ship from Montreal to London, England, and it's his first time in England. And I think very quickly, or even within days, he checks into a psychiatric hospital in London, because he obviously realized just moving around is not really helping out. He's actually mentally ill, which was very good for him that he came to that realization.
Yeah, I read one account that he actually went to England on purpose because he read about the groundbreaking art therapy that was going on from a doctor there. So he specifically chose to check himself into a hospital in England so he could work with a specific doctor who was doing art therapy. Oh,
that makes sense, because I thought he moved there and happened to have like gotten into a hospital where somebody was doing like pioneering art therapy. That makes much more sense, that he like actually knew that was there and it wasn't just like a coincidence.
Yeah, the accounts are a little muddled, because I read one where he was working with Edward Adams, who is like this big pioneer of art therapy, but that he was actually at the second hospital.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure if that like he learned about this doctor later, or if he was trying to get to him the whole time and just needed to go through the first hospital first. Like it's a little unclear, but but he did get to work extensively with art therapy and produced a lot of art as part of his kind of processing and healing process as he was actually dealing with his depression, which is a great thing that he got to experience this form of healthcare and actually found it productive and helpful.
For sure. I think, the art therapy was definitely something that was, I would say probably pretty significant, and if not life-changing for him, because obviously, he's able to utilize this thing that he loves, which is art, and as well as finally kind of getting to create art in a way that isn't just some teacher trying to teach him how to do something in a rigid way. Like, he's actually being able to use it in a hopefully positive way to deal with his mental illness. So he painted quite a few paintings throughout his time when he was a psychiatric patient and when he was in Europe. And so I think particularly you mentioned some of them. So one of the ones that I guess got really creeped out by is his painting called Where Am I? Who Am I? Why Am I? Which was one of his first paintings, or at least one of the paintings he painted during his psychiatric treatment. So it's a painting of him. It looks like he's in the desert, or maybe it is him or someone else, or maybe his manifestation of himself, and he's wearing like a trench coat with a backpack. His hands are out, and it looks like he's blind. He doesn't know where he is or who he is or even why he is, and like his eyes are hollow, and he's like super pale. Like, he looks like a dead person, and it's very creepy. But it's you almost don't even have to read the title of this painting to know what the title of this painting is.
It's very emotionally evocative, especially with the colors that it's used. It's pretty much all just variations of shades of brown through the whole painting.
Especially given the fact that some of his later paintings and many of his other paintings are quite colorful. And I think you mentioned one, which I don't know if it's the same one that I came across, but there's one that's called the Maze. I don't know if that's the one where you were thinking that it looks like it could be the inside of his brain, because it does look like something cut like cut open and cut in half, and it might be a skull.
Yeah, this is one that I read a lot about. It was one that he produced while he was in the hospital, and it became kind of the focal point of a documentary that he was a part of that was about his life and his mental illness and his art and all of that kind of, and how it all wrapped together. That was not produced until 1969. So it was like 15 years after any of this happened. But they made a documentary called The Maze, and it like kind of focused on this painting as well as like all of these interviews and depictions of what he experienced. This is one of the ones that I was describing, the style that is like somewhat surreal, and it's his experience of the world, not necessarily a straightforward depiction of the world. One of the things that your eyes is drawn to especially is a rat that is curled up in the middle of this, what appears to be a looking at a brain that's been cut in half. And so there are different images and like different rectangles among this like quote unquote brain. It's not graphic at all. It doesn't like look like it. No part of it looks like it's actually part of the human body. It's just the shape. It seems like that. But yeah, there's a bunch of squares that it's divided up into, and they have different designs and images in each one. But in the middle, you have this rat that's curled up and appears that it's dead. And of course, all of the associations of like being a rat in a maze and not being able to get out is a way that he expressed the feeling that he had when he was struggling with this deep mental illness.
For sure. It's definitely very complex, and and all of his paintings, they're so detailed, and there are so many little details that you can look at. Like his works, I often see people standing in front of it for like 20 minutes or an hour examining the painting. I mean, I'm not watching the person watching it for an hour, but like
sort of the interpretation that people have pulled from and like things that he's said about it is that showing the rat as like not moving, even though the skull is open now, it suggests that like it's not willing to leave this prison, even though it's been freed. And he wrote in his autobiography, "Now clean me out, I challenge you scientists, and put me back together again. A happy, balanced, mature, fulfilled personality. Lift that rat out and unwind him and let him run free." And so I find that very interesting. Like that's how he was visualizing what healing is for him and what he knew that he needed, but he didn't have yet.
Mm-hmm. So something else that's interesting that happened to him while he was in London is that I believe after he was discharged from the hospital, he actually got a job in London. He got hired by someone called F.A. Pollock, who was a frame maker, and so he became like an apprentice and finisher of frames at his frame shop. He kind of picked up a skill that you wouldn't normally pick up as just like anybody, or if you were just some random Canadian person, you were like, I want to study how to make frames. It's not very easy to just like be able to find a master who can teach you. So again, I'm not sure if he sought this person out, but from what I read, he just like got a job and was like, oh, cool, I get to learn this thing.
Yeah, it's a very good skill to have as an artist, and by other accounts was one that he like continued to practice. Even after he stopped working there, he continued to frame his own work, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, it is great because actually one of the questions I get a lot at the gallery is sometimes about the frames of paintings, and we do have some pretty decorative, ornate, and just really nice frames for a lot of the artworks in the gallery, and many of the frames were not produced by their original artist, or, the artist may have hired a framer or it has been reframed. And Kurelek's works are some of the few where the original frame by the original artist who painted the painting is what's used, and his frames are quite unique. Like if you search for his paintings online, I would try to find ones with the frame, because quite often the frame is a part of the artwork. He paints the frames, he paints them in like funky colors or funky designs, or he molds them into like these pretty cool shapes. I think his frames are works of art just in themselves, and so that's actually one of the first things that I got drawn in. I saw some of his paintings and I was like, these frames are cool. Like they're so unique. I don't see frames like this anywhere else. And the gallery guide who knew about him was like, yeah, he made it himself. And I was like, oh, that's cool.
That is very cool.
Yeah, and that's why I encourage you to actually physically come to Toronto when you are allowed to and take a look at some of these frames in person, because they are quite stunning. And like, most of them are wooden frames. They're finished in like very nice rustic finishes and textures. So like on the computer, it's hard to see how nice they are, but when you see them in real life, you almost want to touch them, even though you're not allowed to. But they're just very beautiful. And so there's one work that that's in the AGO that is really, really cool. And so a bunch of his works, like the painting extends onto the frame. Like either he would paint a part of the painting onto the frame, or the frame is like decorated in a way that's in the theme of the painting. But one work of his that he did that's hanging in the AGO, I think it's probably one of his most famous artworks. It's a painting called Reminiscence of Youth, and it, again, like on the computer, it kind of looks very flat, but when you look at it in real life, it's a painting within a painting. So the outer border is a white trim, and then inside that white trim is a sepia toned painting of a man lying in his bedroom. And then in the center of the painting is another white trim that looks like a window, but that trim is not painted. That trim is like an actual wooden, like projected trim. And then inside that trim is another painting of a field of snow with a hill and children playing in the field and on the hill. And so it's a painting within a painting, but within the painting, it's almost like there's a window in this kid's bedroom, and he's lying there with these kids outside going like, hey, come play with us. And so it's a really cool painting, just having the nature being that there's like two paintings in one painting, but also the tone between the outside and the inside are quite different. The inside, which is the outside of the frame, is dim and dark and like with neutral tones, and the boy that's lying in the bed, like he looks quite depressed and like he doesn't really care. And then in the painting outside the window it's like snow with like all these colorfully dressed children. The kids are like laughing and smiling and making snowballs, having snowball fights, like sledding down the hill. Just overall, it's really bright and sunny and happy. So it's this contrast between the two that's also really striking. And obviously, there's lots of different ways to look at it. You can think of it as, maybe the boy is Kurelek himself, who's inside and he doesn't want to go out and play because he is, depressed and lonely, or you can think of it, maybe he's lying there thinking about his childhood, which has is gone. So there's like this is a great piece I actually take a lot of visitors to, where I don't really say very much. I just say like, hey, like, what do you think? Like, what do you see? What do you think is going on? And people can kind of make up their own stories about what's going on here.
So first of all, this is a really cool painting for the way that it is conceived and has two paintings in one and all of that stuff. And it's also knowing what we've learned about his background and how much he struggled with mental illness. It also is a very emotional painting, and seeing that depiction of loneliness and of missing out on kind of normal childhood that he probably experienced most of the time as a kid growing up is very sad to see. But on a more lighthearted note, this does a little bit remind me of that SpongeBob meme where Squidward is inside watching Patrick and SpongeBob run around outside. Like,
oh my God, yes.
This is just the more depressing version of that.
Oh my God, Kurelek is OG Squidward.
Oh my God. I'm so sorry to the memory of this man.
No. I mean, hopefully, in the afterlife, he's very happy to be compared to a cartoon character.
I hope he's having a good time.
I hope so too. Because unfortunately, I don't want to get into the stereotype of artists having tragic lives, but the ones we talk about tend to.
Well, the only kind of major life event that we haven't touched on that really influenced the rest of his work was his conversion to the Catholicism.
Yes.
Also, while he was in England, it's actually the therapist that he knew while he was in the hospital was Catholic, and gradually he read more and more about it and ended up converting to Catholicism and was formally baptized in 1957. And from that point on, I think for the rest of his life, lived as a very devout Catholic, and it really influenced a lot of his work, both in terms of like the themes of it, and also would often have kind of controversial messages in his art about like the coming apocalypse and things like that. And so that was a really strong feature that influenced a lot of his work as well.
It's a pretty important topic later on in his life, and he returns to Canada eventually. I think he kind of moved back and forth a few times between Canada and England, but he eventually permanently comes back to Canada, and he actually moves to Toronto and lives on Huron Street, which is one street west of the AGO.
There we go.
Yeah, so he lives in Toronto, and then he became involved with the Catholic community here in Toronto as well. And then he meets a gallery owner called Isaacs, and he actually then got a job with in the Isaacs Gallery, and he was particularly hired as a framer because they found out that he had European, especially training from a European Jew who knew how to frame in the traditional way that they do there. They were like, "Oh my God, you're hired!" So he was originally hired there as a framer. So he did framing for lots of different art, and I don't know exactly how it happened, but I'm sure he was like, "Hey, by the way, I also paint since you have a gallery here." So by 1960, he actually ended up putting a couple of his own works into an exhibition at the Isaacs Gallery. So he was able to showcase his work, at a pretty well-known local Toronto gallery. So then progressively from there, his work got noticed. He managed to have a few more exhibitions, kind of got into some group exhibitions, and then he actually had his first solo exhibition at the Winnipeg Art Gallery in 1966. He ended up getting a lot of commissions, and again, he traveled through a lot of Canada, many different parts of Canada, and then he painted a lot of stuff in the Maritimes, the Prairie, out west, as well as, obviously in and around Toronto. So he actually became an author. He published a book called Prairie Boys Winter, and it actually got onto the New York Times as one of the best illustrated books of the year. And sorry, I should mention, he did book illustrations. And so he then eventually became pretty much a children's book illustrator as well. Some of the books that he participated on are books like The Irish in Canada, and Jewish Life in Canada, and then Jewish Home Life in Montreal. So again, kind of calling back to the fact that he himself was a child of Ukrainian immigrants, he kind of dedicated a large part of his life painting the stories of many other immigrant cultures like the Irish and Jewish Canadians in Canada. So kind of nice that he's kind of dedicating or using his art skills to, portray these different types of lives and different stories of Canadians. And then it's he does eventually become quite paranoid as he got older. He did, obviously now at this point, it's the 1960s and 70s. It's the Cold War. There's a looming nuclear war every day basically, and he's studying more and more of, I'm sure, biblical text, and he's convinced the world will end in some sort of nuclear disaster. And to be fair, he probably wasn't the only person who thought that back in the 60s and 70s. And I think I read that he tried, I think he moved to the east end of Toronto at that point, and he tried to build a nuclear bunker in his basement, but the city of Toronto wouldn't give him permit because they were WTF. But again, I'm sure there were lots of other people who were Yeah, that's probably a good idea. But anyway, he doesn't end up building his bunker, although some of his paintings of his studio does look like it's a bunker. So that's pretty much his life up until this point. So
yeah, I feel like most of our kind of discussion back and forth is really focused on his earlier life and his experiences in England, because I think that those formative experiences really just set up everything else in his life. And I mean, of course, he had to struggle with everything that had happened, like as it affected him throughout the rest of his life and his career. But it does seem like after he came back to Canada and settled back in Canada permanently, that he had a relatively successful career without too much continual struggle. Like, he was able to get in these galleries and pick up a pretty steady career pretty quickly. And then once he started working in children's books, like, he became a very successful children's book illustrator. And that's probably why, like, he is continued to be well known and sort of why he like persists in Canadian popular culture more, even though like he has like a huge expansive catalog that we've talked about just a few pieces of. But I think definitely his commercial career is what had helped him probably like in his life, obviously, of being commercially successful and having more money, but also it definitely is probably easier to get your quote unquote like traditional art, get more eyes on that when you also like have this kind of pop culture aspect to your work as well, where people like have name recognition of you as an artist.
He's probably also quite well known these days, mostly because of his, I'm not to give ourselves too much credit, but mostly because of his huge collection of his work in the AGO. And that's actually, he early on, this art collector called Ken Thompson, who was a very wealthy Canadian businessman. He started collecting Kurelek works pretty early on, I think before he was like, super famous, and he ended up having like a very big collection. And in 2001, Thompson donated all of his collection, including this huge library of Kurelek works, to the AGO. And so, all of his, not all, but like a huge portion of his work is now on display at the Canadian galleries for everyone to see. And I think particularly, for a lot of us who live in Toronto or even all over Canada, like when you look at some of these paintings, you'll recognize like where it's from. Especially, for me, especially his paintings in Toronto, but I'm sure if you're from like out east or if you're from out west, you'll notice maybe some of the towns that he's painted, because they're quite detailed. And despite, sort of his cartoony style, like it is actually pretty accurate. So in the AGO, there's a painting of the Don Valley and the bridge that's looking over it, which is just down the street from my house. So everybody who kind of walks by this painting are like, hey, I recognize that. He also painted the Toronto City Hall in this pretty interesting like overhead bird's eye view that's actually you don't actually see a lot when you're living in the city, obviously, like living under this huge immense building. So yeah, like there's so many places where you're like, hey, I recognize that street, or those houses, or that gas station that he painted. So it is definitely, I think, for a lot of us, like it evokes like more emotion rather than looking at some abstract like landscape painting out in the middle of nowhere done by like a group of 7 painter. So yeah, and I'm like just like totally like anyone who likes group of 7 is gonna be like, what does she have against them?
It's really cool to hear about all those spots in Canada and like recognizable spots that he's painted, and like having that sort of distinctly Canadian artist experience, even though you clearly just want to be rude to the other Canadian artist, Betty. I'm just kidding. Yeah. While Kurelek had to like continue to deal with obviously like mental illness throughout his entire life, and it's not just something that goes away, but it was something that like he was able to kind of get a handle on and have different waves throughout his life and still be able to like have what appear to be, for large parts of his life, a happy life with a marriage and a successful career, despite having to also deal with this illness and with a very difficult childhood. So I'm glad that he got to have that, and I'm glad that he was able to be appreciated in his own time and be remembered as well.
Definitely. I mean, so he did, he eventually, he died in 1977. How old was he? Sorry, he was born in 1927, so he was not very old.
No.
So I believe he died of cancer, and he did actually, at the time, he was planning a second trip to Ukraine because he wanted to do a huge mural series depicting the history of Ukrainian pioneer settlement in Canada. So he was actually, I think he was commissioned by the federal government to paint on the walls of the Parliament buildings in Ottawa. So that's actually a quite big commission, and it does seem like a pretty successful gig that he had got. So he did go to Ukraine, but when he came back to Canada, he unfortunately died that November. So he was never able to actually paint those murals on the Parliament buildings, unfortunately. So that's quite sad. But I guess, like, kind of going back to what you were saying before, like it is, I would say it's quite a success story that he was able to achieve the level of success that he did in his life, and he was able to kind of pour his like thoughts and mind into his art in a way that was therapeutic and helped him with his psychological health. And so, and in a way, I think a lot of people probably found his work relatable, and that might be most likely is one of the reasons why they're quite successful and continues to be successful today. Tragic, but nice sometimes.
Well, thank you for introducing this artist to me.
Oh, no problem. No problem.
And thanks everybody out there for listening to this episode of Pictorial. You can find us on Twitter, Instagram at PictorialPod, where we'll be posting some of the images that we talked about today. And there's definitely some good ones from this episode. You can also find our show notes at relay.fm/pictorial. Or if you want to, you can find me on Twitter, Instagram at AspiringRobotFM.
And you can find me on Twitter or Instagram at Articulations_V. I'm also on YouTube as Articulations. And speaking of YouTube, we also have a YouTube channel under Pictorial Podcast, where we have episodes that we upload, where we will also be inserting the same pictures into the video.
Thanks for listening, art enthusiasts.